Welcome, everyone. My name is Camry Wilborn. I am the Presidential Fellow at the Anna Julia Cooper Center, which sits at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. First off, we want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon and morning for some of our West Coast people for the webinar on women of color in the STEM Professoriate. We're excited to have folks from all over the country watching and joining us today. And so in addition to this live webinar, we're also going to be having a discussion on Twitter. And so you can use the hashtag WOC and STEM. If you have any questions that you would like to ask the panelists or the moderator, we'll be pulling those for questions at the end. Just a little bit more about the grant and the webinar. This webinar is based upon work supported by the National Science Foundation. And the Anna Julia Cooper Center is a part of an alliance for graduate education and the Professoriate Alliance with Vanderbilt University and Fisk University. And so our alliance is developing and studying and refining a model to recruit, retain, and advance women of color from doctoral degree attainments to postdoctoral fellowships to tenured track positions in STEM. We're also seeking to advance knowledge about models and to improve pathways to the professoriate and success of women of color graduate students and postdoctoral fellows and faculty positions in the STEM fields. And so any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this webinar are those of participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. And so when we were thinking about what we wanted to do with this program, we noticed that despite public attention focused on addressing underrepresentation of women of color in STEM, the voices of women of color who are in the pipeline or who have exited are often missing from the discussion. And so with this webinar, we hope to highlight the voices of women of color and to challenge if we're asking the right questions when we're thinking about and focusing on the issues that affect women of color in the STEM Professoriate. And so in 2013, the Institute for Women's Policy Research released a report, Accelerating Change for Women Faculty of Color in STEM. And so it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cynthia Hess, who is the Associate Director of Research at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. She's going to share an overview of the latest data about representation of women of color in STEM and the Professoriate pipeline.
Great, thank you. First of all, just thanks for the invitation to give a quick overview of the data from our report, Accelerating Change. This report was it was based on a day-long convening that was funded by the National Science Foundation's Advance Program, which brought together about 50 experts to just talk about the causes of women of color's underrepresentation in STEM faculty positions and to identify some key policy and programmatic shifts for accelerating the pace of change. The participants came from a range of backgrounds, but held a shared commitment to expanding opportunities for women of color to advance in academic STEM careers and a common recognition that this is essential for advancing the nation's global leadership in STEM. So to contextualize the convening discussions, we analyzed some data from the National Science Foundation and the National Center for Education Statistics that show that while there's been progress for women of color in STEM fields, there is still a long way to go toward proportional representation in the professoriate as well as in earlier stages of the pipeline. In 1993, women of color constituted about 2% of those who held doctorates in STEM fields and were employed as assistant, associate, or full professors at four-year colleges, universities, and affiliated centers and institutes. And their share of the working age US citizen population at this time was about 10%. By 2010, the share of STEM faculty positions that women of color held in relation to the total population had increased, but only slightly. Women of color were 6% of those who held doctorates in STEM fields and were employed as professors and were 15% of the US citizen working age population. The levels of representation among women of color in the STEM professoriate vary by race and ethnicity. Among women of color, Asian Americans are the largest group in the STEM professoriate. In 2010, they were about 4% of assistant, associate, and full professors. Underrepresented minority women, including Latinas, Black, Native American, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, and multiracial women were together about 2.1% of the STEM professoriate. But it's worth noting that there is significant variation within these broad racial and ethnic categories. So that needs to be kept, this needs to be kept in mind as well. The representation of women faculty of color in STEM fields also varies somewhat by discipline. We looked at 4 STEM disciplines, the biological, agricultural, and other life sciences, computer and mathematical sciences, engineering, and physical and related sciences, and found that for women faculty of color as a whole, as for white women, the highest level of representation is in the biological and other life sciences. Another trend in the data that I think is important to note is that there's a significant decline in the representation of women faculty of color in STEM between the level of assistant and full professor. Underrepresented minority women are 3.2% of assistant professors in STEM, 2.9% of associate professors, and 1% of full professors. Among Asian American women, a similar decline takes place. The same is true for white women and men of color, although the differences are proportionally less. White men with STEM doctorates have the highest and most consistent levels of representation throughout the professorial ranks. They hold 45% of assistant professorships, 55% of associate professorships, and 68% of full professorships. So these data point to the need to accelerate the pace of change and ensure that for the benefit of the scientific community and the nation as a whole, the entire STEM talent pool is tapped. And I know that the expert panel today will have a lot to say about the STEM pipeline and what questions need to be asked, what research needs to be done, what policy and programmatic shifts could help to move things forward. And I look forward to hearing this very important discussion.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, for that very extensive overview. Now I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator for the afternoon, Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein. She is a theoretical physics postdoctoral associate at the University of Washington and is an award-winning advocate and writer who promotes equal opportunities for people traditionally locked out of the professionalized sciences.
Thank you so much, Cam, and I really want to thank the Anna Julia Cooper Center for organizing this, to Cam and to Sarah also for all the hard work they put in, and to Melissa Harris-Perry as well for helping us make this happen. So I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. So I'm going to start with actually our most junior person. Margot Beatty is a graduate student in medical physics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but she is in fact moving to UC Berkeley and will be continuing as a PhD student in nuclear engineering there. And Margot is also gender nonconforming, uses she, her pronouns. We are also joined, I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Sofia Cisneros, who is an assistant teaching professor of physics at the University of Denver. And she and I were postdocs together at MIT, so it's exciting to be with her again. We are also joined by Dr. Jamie Valentine, who is a primary patent examiner at the US Patent and Trademark Office and founder of the website African American Women in Physics. So if you've seen data floating around on social media about Black women in physics, there's a decent chance that it came from Jamie's website. And last but not least, we have Professor Evelyn Hammonds, who is the Barbara Gutman Rosencrantz Professor of the History of Science and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard, as well as the Director for the Project on Race and Gender in Science and Medicine at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research, also at Harvard University. So I want to thank all of the panelists and welcome all of you to the panel. And I also want to let the audience know that there will be time for questions at the end. So start thinking about the kinds of things that you might want to ask. So I'm going to start by asking a very basic question that I have found comes up a lot for me. The diversity and inclusion discourse often uses the phrase women and minorities. And some of you have read my thinking about that phrase. And obviously some of us are minority women and some of us are even gender minorities. We have complicated relationship to the idea of womanhood. So I just want to ask the panelists, why should we talk specifically about women of color as a kind of distinct group within the moniker women? So Evelyn, you're on mute. Sorry.
You need to unmute. I think we have to talk about women of color. This construction of women versus minorities is a very old one, probably started as early as the 1970s in some of official policy statements. And what happened as a result of that, the specific needs of women of color were always assumed to be taken care of by programs for minorities or programs by women. But what was actually happening is the programs were for white women, not for all women, and the programs for minorities were actually, much of that was targeted toward minority men. So I think the construction of women and minorities has been problematic from the beginning. And so I think it absolutely is necessary, if we're going to pay attention to the experiences of women of color in STEM, that we have to be very specific about that term. Every time we lose that specificity, then we lose the experience of women of color.
I'm happy for other panelists to jump in, if anybody else. Okay, so we'll move on. I think that we'll probably end up coming back to that question. So there's lots of discussion about women of color in STEM, or there's increasing amounts of discussion about this. And one theme that I've seen is the need to avoid putting pressure on people to go into academia rather than industry or nonprofit work or more directly education-focused work. And so I'm sort of interested in that in the context of a conversation about women of color in the STEM professoriate and in what we sometimes call the pipeline. Why should we be focused on women of color in the professoriate and academia specifically? And how do we have that conversation in a way that's fair to the women that we're talking about?
Well, I guess I'll start on that if you, Jamie, agree to.
Go ahead, Margot.
Okay, I'll speak just based off of being a graduate student in this. My experiences at Wisconsin have been troubling at best, just based off of the isolation that I feel being the only Black woman in my department. So something that I often struggle with is the fact that mentors of mine, some of which are on this panel, are far and few and far in between. And so I often push back with faculty about what are we doing to help increase this. But one of the things that encourages me to go to academia is the fact that there is nobody at this campus, at least, that sits between the next rank of professors and where I am now. So I often feel pressure like, who's going to mentor the next generations of students if I choose to go into industry and the last Black woman in my department came through 7-8 years ago and she chose industry as well. So for me, it's definitely that push of, well, who else is going to do it? And if one of the things I'm often yearning for is having an African-American, let alone a woman of color in my department, because, you know, in my department personally, out of the 72 plus faculty members, 3 of them are women. And of course, all 3 of them are white women. And so having these conversations is difficult to begin with because I can't, for just like Dr. Hammond said, it's often split between minorities or women. And I often argue about how I'm at the intersection and how being at the intersection, I'm forever pushed to the margin because people, again, assume that I'm included in either of those groups. But because I'm in both, it's all, my experience is often forgotten about, especially since I'm the only one that's here.
Jamie, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I agree with what Margot said, but I think that having women of color in the professoriate and on faculty helps to make those departments a more welcoming space. And I think it tends to attract more minority students to those programs. Sometimes in a less diverse department, a lot of things are overlooked about making the space safe and welcoming for all students. So.
Anybody else?
So I would say that the reason we need the women of color, I agree with everything everyone has said. At the same time, we have to understand in many of these departments, because we've been so few for so long, often isolated in the departments that we are in, nobody is in the departments who understands the experiences of students of color, particularly women, with students who are women of color. So when women of color say, you know, I'm being kept out of study groups, I'm not being asked to join the team, my work and my ideas always get shot down. There's no one here that I can really talk to about how I would develop my ideas. Mentoring is not very good. And that's because most of the people in the department have never had a student who was a woman of color, right? They've never seen one. And so part of what happens is a lot of times the advice that's given to women of color is that you should conform, you should fit in, you shouldn't make too much noise, and just get along. Remember, we're in a pipeline, so you're going to go through the pipeline and you're going to come out at the end and be like us and fit in like we are, like we fit in. And that's just not the case. And so to me, the presence of women of color is to validate the experiences of women of color, the talents and creativity of women of color. And in too many departments, we're the only ones who are going to do it. Nobody else is really going to do it.
So like Gen Xers are just like workforce, and like millennials are just like on the internet, and it was just.
I'm going to move on to the third question. So the data about women of color in STEM, and what I think many of us have personally observed, I think many of us on the panel, we see people talking about this on social media and behind closed doors, indicates that the decision to stay in academia or go is a complex convolution of a lot of different factors, right? And so before I get to the question, I just kind of want to say that I want to have care and be aware of the care needed in placing responsibility on individuals versus on systemic processes that are at play. So the decision to go is, you know, a convolution of the impact of discrimination, their needs, dreams, perceptions of the reality of life in academia as shaped by racism, sexism, and other factors. And how do we work to shift the trajectory that this usually produces? Like, how do we, so usually what we see is that women of color are leaving academia because all of these factors just feel very, very heavy. So how do we start making steps to shift that? And, you know, how do we, in some sense, this is about assigning responsibility. And then of course, like the attached question, which is related to the last one, is should we be trying to shift it? A lot of people say, you know what, academia, whatever, like they don't want us, we don't want them. How should we be responding to that?
I think that if there were more women of color, people of color in academia, then the load would not be as heavy. So my impression is that if you are the minority in STEM in the department, then you're called on for a lot of committee work. You're called on for a lot of committee work. You're called on by minority student organizations. You're called on throughout the university, and all of that in addition to mentoring students and getting your research done, and getting grants, ends up being a lot. But some of that working with other people, I think that it wouldn't be such a daunting task.
Now, I completely agree. It's about the ways in which, because we have to make clear the importance of this work. I mean, so my undergraduate degrees are in physics, electrical engineering, computer science. My master's degree is in physics from MIT, and my PhD is in history of science. I wanted to be a professor. That was my goal. And so going through the Professoriate has been, you know, an interesting adventure, which we don't have time to talk about all of the twists and turns of that today. But yeah, of course, because there are so few of us, yet another time, we do have a responsibility to get students behind us. But to take the option of just to say, okay, we'll just take a pass and not be present here means that even the slow rate of change that we've had, we'll have no change if a lot more of us decide that we cannot be here. my position on this is we have to stay, we have to try to make change, and we also have to take care of ourselves, our students, and we have to do our work. And that's just, there's a certain kind of commitment being asked of us that's not often asked of many other people, but that's the facts of the matter.
So can you guys hear me?
Yes.
So I think I agree with everything. But in terms of whether we encourage kids to join academia or to go and do fly fishing in Botswana, like, I don't care what they do as long as they're safe. It's so hard to watch the kids come in and be so separated from everyone else on campus and feel that they have to represent their families. And I think our kids should have a right to do whatever they want and to be supported in that. I mean, it's a numbers game, right? We get enough kids, some of them are going to want to go into academia. I'm sorry, it's hard for me to talk about.
So if I could just jump in really quickly, I think, so first of all, there's nothing to be sorry for, Sophia. I think I won't speak for everyone, but I will say I have certainly spent a lot of time shedding tears over this. And in particular, my husband can tell you that almost every time, I don't want my students to not come talk to me because of this, but almost every single time my student has come into my office with a horror story about, like, oh, I discovered my study group was meeting without me. If I did not, I usually hold it back when the student is there, but I go home and I cry. It's extraordinarily hard for me to watch the students. And so I just, to maybe give some context, I remember when Sophia and I arrived at MIT as postdocs, the Native American students at MIT in different departments, undergraduate students, did not have a way of finding each other. And that Sophia spent the better part of her 3 years at MIT building a way for those students to be able to find each other. So I wanted to first of all honor that Sophia did that incredible work, but also that as postdocs, that's not actually what we were hired to do. We were hired to be researchers in theoretical physics. And so I just kind of wanted to maybe give a little bit of context for that. I don't know if you want to add anything else, Sophia. Okay. And I don't know if anybody else to jump in on this point about, the emotional work that it takes from us.
Well, for me, the emotional work that I've had to do here at Wisconsin has been so overwhelming to the point where I felt and am leaving the institution itself. So for me, I came on campus and the Black Graduate Student Association had not existed for 8 years. And so I took it upon myself and a couple of my really good colleagues to help restart that. But in the process, you really got to learn about the inner workings of not only this institution, but academia in general. And the burnout is real from trying to uplift each other when, just like Dr. Sophia, you're hearing these horror stories all the time from students who are just hurting, students who are just breaking. And then at the same time, you're one of those students who's also reaching your breaking point too. And so after a certain point, it just becomes a matter of self-care. Like, do you want to endure this or do you want to thrive? It's a difference between surviving and thriving. And I feel like the academy does not recognize that for women of color. It's quite frankly unsafe. Like, I've had instances where I'm sitting outside my lab mentoring another undergraduate student at my alma mater, MIT, and then I have this nurse, I work in medical physics, so we're connected to the hospital. I have this nurse come in and tell me, who are you? What are you doing here? The next time I see you, I'm going to call the police. And so this sort of violence that's happening against students who are literally going outside of their job description to help one another, like, it's still dangerous, it's still harmful. These instances still stay with me, and this happened 1.5 years ago, and I will probably continue telling this story for the rest of my life, but it really just comes down to like, how much is enough? Like one of the things I really am concerned about is like, we keep saying like, should we encourage? Like, of course, students like myself want to see more of us, but I cannot fathom what the people on this panel have had to go through to get to where they are now, because I'm sitting here just a lowly graduate student hurting. And it makes me wonder, like, not necessarily is it worth it, because I know that it is, but it's not like it doesn't cross my mind where I have those questions, where is it worth it? Because we've all had those moments where we question, like, I definitely want to make sure that it's better for the next student, but like at what expense to my mental health? And that's so far what my 3 years in graduate school have shown me. It's like, you can do the work, but nobody in your department understands, because nobody's woman of color on faculty understands what it's like to even be at this level. And of course, there's the push and pull of like wanting to do more for your community, but of course that not being recognized in your graduate program, because if you have time to put towards other things, that means you're not giving your all towards research. So then you're looked down upon. For me, like, I'm taking time out of lab to be here, and luckily my PI is understanding, but it's like, are my lab mates understanding of the significance of this? Do they understand how this is a life-giving experience for me to sit on a panel of such wonderful women? Like, no. And that's the problem, is that people claim that this is valued, but then at the end of the day, it's not acknowledged. And then when it really comes down to where these merits are rewarded, you don't see any extra gold stars for me starting a Black graduate organization, for me bringing speakers on campus, or for me just enduring these atrocities that my cis heterosexual white male colleagues don't have to deal with in the first place.
So let me build on that. And I was kind of get to this later, but you know, one of the things that often kind of gets talked about in maybe hushed tones is that we don't always even have good experiences getting mentoring from older women. And I think in particular, a lot of us have had not so great mentoring experiences with white women. But I think in general, you know, there's a selection effect of the kind of woman who was able to get her foot through the door 20 or 30 years ago. And so I'm kind of wondering, you know, what are the responsibilities of women of color to each other? What are our responsibilities to people who are junior to us? What are our responsibilities to people who are, you know, kind of walking the path with us? And, you know, what do those responsibilities look like across racial lines? You know, if I'm a Black woman mentoring a Native American student, or you know, a Native American woman mentoring a Black student, how because there's a lot of pressure. I think like what Sophia was saying is that there's a lot of pressure on us to carry people, and there's a lot of difficult choices that have to be made. So how do we mediate that? How do we think about that? I don't know if anybody wants to jump in.
I'll jump in. I think that, when I think about the ways that I mentor the diverse mentees that I have mentees of both who are male and female, and of a number of different races. And I don't think I mentor them differently. The same, I think I do kind of come across, I look at what they need individually, and I try to help them to get to where their goals are and whatever the pitfalls are. I think all my mentees are aware of the challenges that face women of color in physics and engineering. And I guess that's for the benefit of the community. But I wanted to circle back to your previous question about the emotional work of being in academia. And it hits on something that Marco said. One of the main reasons why I chose not to pursue an academic career was not the extra committee work or the mentoring or helping people. It was having to prove to people that I was actually here because I was smart and because I did great work, not just because I'm Black and not just because I'm a woman. My research advisor told the other people in the lab, well, Jamie's gonna have it easy because she's Black, she's a woman, she's an American citizen. You guys, who are all Chinese, are gonna have to work 3 times as hard because everybody's gonna want her. And I look around the department and there are no Black professors, and there are more than a few Chinese professors. And just the emotional work When I walk into a room, people assume that I'm not the professor, that I'm not the speaker, even now sometimes. That emotional work in academia is soul crushing, and it just wasn't for me. I'm so proud of those of you who decided to stay with it, and I support you in any way that I can. But for me, I just needed a different quality of life.
Well, I think one of the things that this conversation shows, and many of the conversations that I have with students of color, especially African American women, is that whatever anybody out there thinks about mentoring programs or mentoring policies, let's just be really clear. They are broken for us. They are broken for women of color. They are not working. Not 2 weeks ago, I had a postdoc, African American woman postdoc, in my office, sobbing. And this is, this is a routine situation. She supposedly has mentors, but those mentors are not serving her. So I think one of the absolutely most important things that we have to do right now is to fix the mentoring issue. We have to build different kind of networks. We have to build stronger networks. We have to build sustainable networks, because right now, whatever this piecemeal kind of thing that's happening, sometimes people get assigned a mentor formally or informally, they provide somebody for you, whatever. It's all broken. It's just plain broken. And so we're not going to get people to be able to be in academic institutions if they don't get support, if they don't get the kind of support that everybody who does science deserves. So I think to me, it's the number one issue. We have to insist to get better mentoring. And if we don't get it, we're going to have to create it. We have to create something that's really about better mentoring.
So I think, of course, women of color across academia face underrepresentation. Like there aren't, tons of women of color running around the Harvard History of Science department, I think, or the history department, right? Definitely not the philosophy department. So I'm kind of curious, what do you all see in your view as being specific to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? And I do think that this connects, to the mentoring issue. And in relation to that, how do departments develop the competencies to see women of color through from assistant, from hiring, first of all, actually getting even hired, then from assistant to professor, all the way through to full professor, not having someone exit before they make it to associate and get tenure. And then, that 7 years between associate and full. So I'm interested, people have a lot of problems with the pipeline analogy, but how do we re-envision that? And what about it is STEM specific? I don't know. So I'm kind of looking at you, Evelyn, since you're the person who's walked all the way through to a named chair, which is, an extraordinary accomplishment.
Okay, I can talk about that. I mean, as I said, I think first I don't like the pipeline metaphor, because it suggests that all we have to do is put some black women in front of the door. The door is going to open. The next door is going to open. The next door is going to open, and voila! Someday we're going to all be full professors. I don't think that's the way it works. So I think, as I just said, sort of re-envisioning what mentoring is. For myself personally, I have a lot of mentors. I've always had a lot of mentors, and that helps. I have all kinds of mentors. I've had white men, I've had white women, I've had minority, I've had African-American men and women, and I needed all of them. It really truly does take a village. It takes a lot of people. You need people inside your institution, outside your institution. You need people you just need friends who, at 3 o'clock in the morning, when you just can't do it anymore, it's going to bring you a peanut butter sandwich. You just got to have all kinds of folks in your life to help you get through this. And so, and I want to say that I know that's not fair, but I actually think that because we really haven't spent as much time talking about what the cultures are like inside of STEM. So, for example, I did this introduction to a screening of Hidden Figures the other day, the film about the African-American women in mathematics and one engineer at NASA. Okay, so people are looking at that film thinking what was happening to those women is something from the past, but it's not. It's what's going on still for so many women of color, particularly because we're still in institutions where we're really isolated. There was the group of women in the film who worked in the West Computer Group. I've never worked with that many women of color anywhere, ever before in my life. My experience is much more like what Katherine Johnson was dealing with every day, which is walking into that big room with the guys in the, with the white shirts on and the skinny ties and the whole thing. That was my experience. At least she had those other women to go home to every day and talk with. I've never had that. I've never seen that. And so people don't realize that while the film is a story of triumph and inspiration, it doesn't mean that things have changed for everybody else. And in fact, that's the central question that somebody in these kind of projects that we're working on has to address. Why haven't we been able to make these things change? So it's the deep culture of STEM, cultures of STEM. And we can talk about what we as women of color need to do, but somebody's got to start talking about why those cultures and communities have been so resistant, so closed, so committed to challenging and questioning our intellectual capacity, our personal commitment. There were a lot of guys in my group when I was studying physics at MIT who liked to go contra dancing every week. Nobody gave them a hard time for doing contra dancing. But if I went off to do something like this, then, I was doing something that wasn't acceptable. So why are the things they do in their lives are okay, but the things we do in our lives are not okay? There are deep questions we need to ask about why STEM cultures are so committed to homogeneity, so committed to people looking like them, fitting in like them, dressing like them, and not having any kind of opening for people to be themselves so that they can do their best work. This is a very profound set of questions. Those are not questions for us now. Those are questions for them.
So Sophia, I wonder if I could call on you to respond to this coming from the other end as someone who's just starting sort of the trek forward as faculty.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that this is a question that should rightfully land on our department chairs and on all of our white faculties. I think, in my opinion, calculus happened in two different continents at the same time, spontaneously, right? It happened to Newton and it happened to Leibniz. But if we look at physics right now, it's broken. There's quantum mechanics and relativity, and they do not hold hands. And so I think that is a reflection of the white male brain, right? It is a dichotomy between the two halves, which is fine. Like you said, I have a lot of white male mentors, City College, ton of Jews that taught me like painstakingly every single day. But on the flip side, I have also department chairs who've told me that I'm mentoring and trying to take care of all these minority kids because it's fun for me, right? It's like how I entertain myself or something. So, yeah, I mean, in my opinion, globally, we're coming to a crisis, right? And this is a direct result of our science, our technology. And that is a direct result of the brains which have formulated it. And if we want to save this planet, I mean, I know everyone's excited about exoplanets, but they look hideous, right? And we can't get to them. They're light years away, and we can't even travel a fraction of the speed of light. So I'm not impressed. And I love calculus, and I love the physics that has been handed down to me from the forefathers of this country or whoever, but I don't think they've perfected it. And I don't think that they've discovered the last word on how we do physics and how we do calculus. I think they've opened the chapter. But that's why I think we need each other, because I like it here. I think this is a good planet. I think humanity actually has great potential to be awesome, but we're just, we're carrying the burden right now as women, because I don't know why. I mean, our male minority students are at risk all the time as well. Our women minority students don't speak out about it. They all feel stereotype threat all the time. So yeah, why do they want to stay here? I had a Sudanese student just a couple of days ago decide she doesn't want to be in the engineering physics anymore because she doesn't feel welcome on this white campus, right? It's too much. you know, with the ban on travel to her country. And I don't know. So yeah, we're tired. Emotionally, it's exhausting. But I think we have to, especially right now, we have to keep fighting until we don't have even like an ounce of energy left. That's, yeah, that's all.
So kind of speaking of the cultures and kind of what academia looks like. So I'm getting to the point where we're going to start moving into questions from the audience. But before, so all of you have engaged in some kind of data collection, research, to the presence. But you know, by virtue of the mentoring that you've done, the kind of research that you have taken on, what patterns have emerged in your work that, you know, basically this is your chance, like what is it that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure that the audience knows about? And, you know, I also want to make sure to kind of explicitly call out that as mentioned, you know, we started out with a lot of statistics, very hard statistics to hear. Women of color from different ethnic minority groups do experience different trends. And so I'm curious if, you know, there are things that people have observed that they, you know, for example, the difference between Native American and Black women's experiences, or even, you know, Sophia as a Latina and a Native woman, what you see as experiences that are different. And then I'm also kind of curious, what are people's data wish lists? I am always thinking about the data that isn't being collected that I would like to have. And that I would like sociologists who are maybe doing women in physics stuff or women in astronomy or women in STEM stuff, you know, to ask about gender identity as well as race at the same time, not one or the other. Like, I would like to know about how many people are gender nonconforming. I would like to know how many women are lesbian, queer, bisexual, how many people are transgender, but not just like about the white ones. And you know, often what we hear, and I've been trying to call this out, I'll stop in a second, I'll just say like, you know, a lot of times you pull up these charts and Native Americans aren't on them because people say, oh, the numbers are very low, so we can't report them. Isn't the fact that the numbers are so low that you can't report them a data point? So I just kind of, this is your moment to talk about the data, what you see, the problems with it, what you'd like people to know.
Well, I think it's a great question. I think number one, we still don't have enough data about the experiences of women of color from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different sexual orientations, all of that. I think we've just scratched the surface of really understanding who really is trying to do this work and what their commitments are. Their commitments both as women of color, but also their commitments as scientists and engineers and STEM and the other STEM fields. So I think that's an important piece. But I want to say that the second part is this. There are a lot of fields in this country that have changed over the course of the last 30 years into the 21st century, where people of color are advancing with a lot less, with facing barriers that are lower. We are not facing barriers that are lower. The barriers are still high. I want to understand that, which means people need sociologists of science, the people at the National Science Foundation, people who are building these programs, have to understand what is happening that has who made the resistance to our presence in STEM so high. That means they need to talk to more white male leaders of science and STEM fields, more white men in the fields right now. We need to understand, why is it we are such a threat? Because I don't think we understand the threats, but they are threatening us all the time. And so that, to me, is profoundly misunderstood, because this is not happening in the legal profession. It's happening less and less in the medical profession. But why is this still happening in such a strong way in STEM fields? I think that's an important question that we have got to demand an answer to.
if I may, I recently had this conversation. We had a women's luncheon for my department. We do this annual symposium called the John Cameron Lecture. And we had the third woman in 30 years to be the John Cameron lecturer for this year. And so then that begged the conversation of like, why? So let's have a conversation on women, and me being on my way out. And after 3 years of enduring Madison, Wisconsin, coming from South Central Los Angeles, I finally had the courage of speaking up about my experiences. So of course, I dominated the conversation because I know they've never heard this narrative, because I know they've never met a Black female medical physicist before. And so one of the things that I brought up was just going off of what Dr. Hammonds said, was just like, why don't you guys see a problem with this? And one of my friends made a Facebook post talking about science is universal, international, inclusive, nonpartisan, apolitical, agender, a-race, and a-ideological. Don't inject identity politics into science. And so for me, this is mind-boggling, and this sort of answers your question, is the fact that like science hasn't changed because scientists see, when I say scientists, of course, I mean the majority, see no problem with what is going on right now. So that conversation that I had at lunch led to another follow-up conversation that I had with the graduate chair in my department, as well as another intimidating yet renowned professor in our department. And this perceived objectivity of science is one of the things that I think is really hindering how diverse our field is. It's the thing that we think that, oh, we're just not getting enough applicants, there's just not enough people. And I'm like, do you seriously believe that we make up 14% of the population, but that only 2% of us are qualified to be in positions where you are? I think that thought is problematic to begin with, and nobody has checked it before. I think the fact that the people, I worry about the fact that the faculty already is homogenous as I don't know what, right? All of my professors that I've had in this department have been white men, right? And so then the fact that the people who we are bringing into these assistant and associate positions look exactly like them, and how nobody has a problem with it. I'm like, these are the people behind these next level, and you keep telling me that this is going to get better, but the next generation looks exactly the same. And so then I had the admissions chair look me in my face and say, well, our admissions committee isn't biased. And I almost fell out my chair, because it's like, there were simple questions that we'd ask, like, are you blinding these applications for these example? For example, are you recruiting at historically Black colleges and institutions? Like, where are you sending this information to? Is sending a representative to 1 or 2 conferences and handing a couple students of color a couple pamphlets enough to you? And if it is, that's a problem, because that's not enough to get me at an institution. And I had to really push back on the fact that, like, if you truly believe that your field, that your admissions committee of 5 white men is not biased, then we have a lot more work to do in this department. And that's just the start of it. It's like, if you can't even see what's wrong with it, if you can't even see like requiring the GRE form of bias and discrimination for this department, then we have a lot of work to do. And this again is from not having people in these positions to push back. And so somebody had the nerve to ask me, so you think that admissions departments weren't biased 40 years ago as well? And I was like, you mean 40 years ago when prestigious institutions literally would not allow me to be sitting in this position where I am now, based solely on the color of my skin? And then the whole room kind of stopped and just thought about it and was like, wow, I guess you're right. So people aren't even pushing back. It's like, we need to do more. Let's raise more money. Let's get more fellowships for these students. But my main issue is not the financial support here at Wisconsin. My main issue is the retention. My main issue is the mentorship. How these 3 women who are faculty members have never reached out to me on the basis of—
Margot, I'm going to interrupt you just to say that you've stopped on a point that actually is related to an audience question, and we're getting into kind of the audience questions. So I want to, this actually connects to what you've been saying, and so you may want to come back to it. One of the questions that we got is, when thinking about the discourse surrounding underrepresentation in STEM, there seems to be a huge focus on K through 12 STEM education and generating interest in the field. I'm going to editorialize a lot, as if Black students, Native students don't have an interest in the natural world, don't have an interest in science. And so this person said, in my experience, a lot of African Americans come into college interested in STEM, and I'm editorializing again when I say this is backed up by the data. So how can we start to change these narratives so that we're asking the right questions and actually going to the right places? And so in some sense, are we putting too much on K through 12? And I don't know if, Sophia, you want to tackle that as someone who's kind of worked on both sides.
My opinion is that we need to give our kids science that they actually love, right? So the kids have to be doing stuff that they love. And so when I teach physics to undergraduates and they've never connected Fibonacci sequence to the calculus introduction on series and sequences, how can I expect them to think it's magical or cool or something that they want to invest their life in, right? So, I mean, we do a lot of outreach with the little kids, and especially now that I'm at Denver, because there's more Native Americans in this city than there is in all of Massachusetts. So I have colleagues here at this campus. I'm not lonely all the time. It's wonderful, you know? But I don't know. I just think we have to figure out what science means to us as Black physicists, as red physicists, as yellow physicists. What does it mean? Why do we love it? And then we have to somehow communicate that, yeah, to little kids, but also to these, 19, 20-year-old kids, because they don't know either, right? And they're struggling because they don't have the preparation as their classmates do. They don't have private tutors. And so it's hard already for them. They don't feel like they fit in, like they're supposed to be in the study groups or go to tutoring or whatever. But then if on top of that, the material is dry and boring and it just sucks, right? I think all of us have the capacity to flip the material because we see it as beautiful, right? That's why we're doing it. And so giving that to them, not presenting the party line all the time. That's my opinion, how to help them a little bit.
That's beautiful. Jamie, I don't know if you kind of want to jump in on this as someone who's looking at it from industry.
Yeah, I think that it is, I think that in order to create physicists, you have to have children who love science and math and who see themselves in that. So that's why I'm sure we all do outreach work where we go and just talk to children in classes. And most of the time, if I'm at a minority school or public school, the children are just shocked that I'm the physicist. And you see a light bulb come on for them, like, oh, well, now this is a possibility for me. So that's really important. I wanted to circle back when you asked about what data excites you question. I wanted to talk about why I am optimistic about women of color in STEM. In physics, at least, the number of women, African American women who've gotten PhDs in physics, I would like to say it's exploded in the past 5 years. In the 90s, we would get maybe 1 or 2 per year, and now we're averaging like 7 or 8 Black women getting a PhD in physics per year. And when you combine that with the ability to interact through social media networks, you can just call, email somebody you've never met before. Hey, I'm looking for a postdoc, you're looking for a postdoc. Let's not recreate the wheel. I think that we're going to see an amazing blossoming of Black women in STEM. And I'm optimistic about it. And I'm just trying to see what all I can do to assist with that. The data I would like to see is that like departments to keep track of not just how many students graduate, but also how many students start and then leave and what their gender and race is.
So since we're getting close to the end, let me ask another question. So actually there were 2 really good questions here that I'm torn about. So I'm just going to mention and you can pick one. One of the questions was that from Johnny Moore Dotson, who's seeing that there are increasing requirements for diversity statements during job searches. And so one question is this translating to increasing diversity in departments? Is this the right approach? And then also people are curious, what supports have panelists found to help them thrive and support them as they face challenges navigating academia? So if you can give a quick answer, I would love to hear something from each of you, and we'll start with Evelyn.
So I think that the support that I have really is, as I said earlier, having lots of mentors. It's really important to have trusting people inside your department, outside of your department, outside of your institution, but people who understand people who understand what you're trying to accomplish and help you reach your goals. But I also think, following what Jamie just said, using social media to really create wider and deeper networks is going to be an important part of that picture. There is no way that at this point in time, people should be going through systems to get jobs in industry or to go through the professoriate to not have someone ahead of you to help you run, get through the system. If you don't have anybody ahead of you, that's going to be a difficult situation. So, I mean, I think, as I've said throughout this conversation, real mentoring works. Real mentoring, where people actually invest in people and invest in their success, is something that is taken for granted for white men, but not taken for granted for women of color. That's what we have to make that the new normal, that people get cared for and taken by the hand and help to reach their potential.
Jamie?
Okay. I think I missed a little bit of the question. It was about community support.
Yeah, so about what kind of supports have helped you survive, helped you thrive?
Oh, for me, it was interacting with my peers through different conferences. And even now, like I do a lot of interacting, I guess on Facebook, but just interacting with people who understand my experience, who have seen me through the tough times, but also my family support. My mom is like my biggest cheerleader. She believes I can do more than I actually can do. And my sweetie, he is a big proponent of if it's never been done before, you do it. Why not? Like, let's go for it. So all of the out of the box thinking and projects that my peers and then also my family support.
I think mine is the same. Just family and creating a network of people. I mean, I pray all the time. And sometimes I pray with great amounts of desperation. So I think that's helpful.
Margot, do you have anything you want to add?
Sure. So for one, ways I feel supported is my PI. He's one of the ones who allows me to do everything that I do on campus and just never complain, because he understands that I'm committed to not only uplifting my community and having more people like me in my position, but also to the research that I signed up for in the first place. My organization, which has allowed me to meet wonderful people like Dr. Hammonds, who spoke at one of our events last year. My mentors, Dr. Chanda right here, people who hold me down and who I've cried to time and time again, my parents, and also something that often uplifts me when even I'm not feeling it is I talk to my mentees a lot about what I'm going through so that they're not disillusioned when they get to my position. So one of my mentees is a first-year PhD student at University of Chicago, and she has been going through it as the only woman, the only person of color, and of course, consequently, the only Black person in her lab, Black woman in her lab. And so a lot of the times we talk and I tell her what I'm going through, but being able to encourage her and see the exponential amount of growth and self-confidence she's grown in herself as a product of apparently what she said is by channeling some Margot, which I'm humbled and surprised about, but it's just so invigorating to know that the people that you're sticking this out for see you, hear you, and want to continue on based solely off of your work ethic and the stuff that you've been trying to do from the get-go, which is get more of them in this field. So those are my foundations.
That's amazing. So I want to thank all of you so much and for doing this panel and for joining us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Cam.
Yeah, so on behalf of the entire team here at the Anna Julia Cooper Center, we want to offer our sincerest thank you to, first of all, our participants, Evelyn, Jamie, Margot, and Sophia. Thank you all for taking the time today to be a part of this. And a really big thank you to Dr. Chanda Prescod-Weinstein for helping us plan this event, giving us access to her network of people, and really making this everything that it was. This was a great conversation to really challenge some of the discourses around underrepresentation in STEM, and we are so grateful to have all of you here. And lastly, thank you to everyone who is watching live on YouTube, and for those of us who followed via Twitter. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.